There's a moment that arrives for almost every avoidant, sometimes while a relationship is still intact, more often after it has already ended, when the specific quality of what they had finally becomes visible in a way it never quite managed to while they still possessed it. This recognition doesn't arrive as a single dramatic epiphany. It builds slowly, through comparison, through absence, through the quiet accumulation of evidence that whatever they're currently experiencing, whether alone or with someone new, simply doesn't measure up to what they once had access to and treated as ordinary. Once this recognition fully settles, something happens inside the avoidant that looks almost nothing like the composed, unbothered exterior they've spent years cultivating, and understanding exactly what that internal shift involves offers real clarity to anyone who has wondered whether their own worth was ever actually seen. If the listener has spent time wondering whether an avoidant partner ever truly understood what they had, whether their patience, their consistency, their genuine care ever registered as anything beyond ordinary or expected, this exploration is going to trace exactly what happens once that recognition finally arrives, and why it so rarely produces what people initially expect it to. To understand why this recognition takes so long to develop, it helps to understand what typically obscures value from an avoidance perception while a relationship is still active. Avoidants often struggle to accurately perceive stability and consistency as valuable precisely because these qualities don't register the way excitement or novelty does. Consistency, by its nature, tends to feel unremarkable in the moment it's being offered, a steady presence that doesn't announce itself the way drama or uncertainty might. This means an avoidant partner, surrounded by exactly the kind of reliable, patient care that most people spend years searching for, often fails to register its significance simply because nothing about receiving it feels urgent or dramatic enough to command their full attention. This is worth naming directly, because it explains a specific, painful pattern many people experience, offering genuine, consistent care throughout a relationship, only to watch it seemingly go unnoticed or unappreciated, while behaviors requiring far less genuine investment somehow captured more of the avoidant's engaged attention. This wasn't because the care being offered lacked value, it was because value delivered consistently, without drama or uncertainty attached, simply doesn't register the same way to a nervous system that has learned, through whatever earlier experiences shaped it, to associate significance primarily with intensity rather than with steadiness. It's worth exploring what specifically triggers the eventual shift in perception, because it rarely happens through simple reflection alone. Comparison tends to be the primary mechanism, and this comparison usually requires direct, lived experience of something different in order to actually register. An avoidant who moves into a new relationship, particularly one lacking the same consistency and patience they previously received, often begins noticing, gradually and sometimes uncomfortably, the absence of qualities they'd never had to actively appreciate before because they'd never previously experienced their absence. This new relationship doesn't need to be worse in every respect. It simply needs to reveal, through direct contrast, what specific qualities the previous relationship actually provided that this new one doesn't. There's something worth naming here about how this comparison process unfolds even when an avoidant remains single rather than entering a new relationship immediately. Loneliness itself often produces a similar effect, stripping away the daily comfort and stability a previous relationship provided and replacing it with the specific, unfamiliar discomfort of managing life's ordinary difficulties without a reliable partner to share them with. This absence tends to sharpen memory considerably, making previously unremarkable moments of care and consistency suddenly feel significant in retrospect, precisely because their absence now makes their earlier presence impossible to ignore or take for granted any longer. It's worth examining what this recognition actually feels like from inside the avoidance experience, because it rarely resembles simple, straightforward gratitude. It's considerably more complicated, layered with regret, with a specific kind of self-directed frustration at having failed to recognize something valuable while it was still available to be appreciated, and often with genuine grief that operates independently of whether reconciliation remains possible or desired. This complexity matters because it explains why an avoidant's eventual acknowledgement of someone's value, when it does surface, often carries a weight and specificity that feels different from earlier, more superficial expressions of appreciation offered throughout the relationship itself. There's a particular quality worth naming about how this recognition typically develops in stages rather than arriving all at once, because understanding this progression helps clarify why the initial signs of recognition often look considerably smaller and less certain than what eventually develops. The earliest stage usually involves simple, isolated moments of noticing, a specific memory surfacing unexpectedly during an unrelated activity, a small comparison drawn almost involuntarily between a current experience and how something similar used to unfold. These isolated moments don't yet form a coherent understanding. They're simply data points accumulating slowly, each one adding weight to a pattern the avoidant hasn't yet consciously assembled into a complete picture. As these isolated moments continue accumulating, they gradually coalesce into something closer to genuine understanding. A recognition that extends beyond individual memories into broader awareness of what specific qualities made the previous relationship distinctly valuable. This stage often produces the first genuine discomfort associated with this entire process, because understanding what was lost necessarily involves confronting the specific role the avoidant's own behaviour played in that loss. It's considerably easier to miss a general sense of companionship than to confront the specific, uncomfortable recognition that one's own withdrawal, one's own difficulty with vulnerability, one's own patterns of dismissiveness or coldness directly contributed to losing access to something genuinely valuable. It's worth exploring what typically happens once this recognition reaches its fullest, most uncomfortable stage, because the response varies considerably depending on factors specific to each individual avoidant. Some respond with genuine, if delayed, motivation towards self-examination, finally engaging with therapy or honest self-reflection they'd previously avoided, motivated specifically by not wanting to repeat the same pattern of failing to recognize value until it's already gone. Others respond by minimizing the recognition, constructing narratives that soften their own role in the loss, attributing the relationship's ending primarily to circumstance or incompatibility rather than to their own contributing patterns. This divergence matters considerably for understanding what, if anything, this recognition ultimately produces beyond private, internal discomfort. There's something worth naming directly here for the listener, wondering whether this recognition, once it develops, tends to translate into any kind of direct communication or attempted reconciliation. It's worth being honest that this translation happens considerably less often than people typically hope for, not because the recognition itself isn't genuine, but because acting on it requires a level of vulnerability many avoidants remain unable to access, even after genuinely understanding what they lost. Admitting directly to the person they hurt that their absence has revealed something significant requires exposing precisely the kind of emotional openness that avoidant patterns are specifically designed to avoid. This means genuine private recognition and any external acknowledgement of that recognition frequently remain entirely separate, the former happening reliably, while the latter often never occurs at all. It's worth exploring why this gap between private recognition and external acknowledgement matters so much for anyone hoping this process might eventually lead to reconciliation. Waiting for an avoidant's private recognition to translate into direct communication often means waiting indefinitely, because the same patterns that produce the original relationship's difficulties, discomfort with vulnerability, difficulty initiating uncomfortable conversations, tendency toward avoidance rather than direct confrontation, remain fully intact even after genuine internal recognition has developed. This means the listener hoping for confirmation that their value was eventually understood may need to accept that this confirmation, however genuinely deserved, may simply never arrive in any form they can directly witness or receive. There's a particular consideration worth naming about what this recognition, even when it never becomes externally visible, actually represents for the listener's own healing and understanding of what happened. It's worth considering that the accuracy of this internal recognition, regardless of whether it's ever communicated, still matters as objective truth about what the relationship actually contained. An avoidant's failure to recognize value while it was present doesn't mean that value was never real. It simply means their capacity to perceive it accurately was limited by patterns entirely their own, patterns that eventually corrected themselves through the specific mechanism of loss and comparison, even if that correction happened too late to preserve or restore what had been lost. It's worth examining too how this recognition sometimes shapes an avoidance approach to subsequent relationships, even when it never produces any communication back to the original person whose value prompted it. Having genuinely learned through direct comparison and loss what consistency and patience actually contribute to a relationship's health, some avoidants begin approaching future partners with a different, more attentive appreciation for exactly these qualities, less likely to take steady, reliable care for granted the way they previously did. This shift, when it happens, represents a genuine, if indirect, form of legacy that the original relationship provided, shaping how the avoidant engages with intimacy going forward, even without ever directly crediting the specific person whose value first taught them this lesson. For the listener who has wondered whether their own worth, their own patience, their own consistent care throughout a difficult relationship was ever genuinely seen and understood, there's something worth holding on to here, regardless of whether any confirmation ever arrives. The absence of visible acknowledgement doesn't mean the recognition never happened. It simply means recognition and communication remain separate processes for someone whose entire relational strategy has been built around avoiding exactly the kind of vulnerability that direct acknowledgement would require. Trusting that genuine value tends to eventually register, even in someone whose defenses previously prevented them from perceiving it clearly, offers a kind of quiet validation that doesn't depend on ever hearing it confirmed directly. There's a specific dimension worth exploring here concerning how this recognition process interacts with an avoidance memory itself, because memory doesn't simply record events neutrally, it reconstructs them. And this reconstruction changes considerably once genuine recognition of lost value begins to develop. Early in a relationship's aftermath, an avoidance memory of specific moments tends to remain coloured by whatever defensive narrative justified their withdrawal in the first place. Difficult conversations remembered as evidence of incompatibility, moments of vulnerability remembered as excessive or overwhelming. As genuine recognition develops, these same memories often undergo a kind of quiet revision. The same difficult conversation later remembered as evidence of a partner's genuine investment in making things work. The same moment of vulnerability later understood as an entirely reasonable request that the avoidant's own defensiveness had simply been unable to receive graciously at the time. It's worth examining why this memory revision matters so significantly for understanding the depth of an avoidant's eventual recognition, because it reveals something more substantial than simple nostalgia or selective idealization of the past. Genuine recognition doesn't just involve missing what was lost in a general wistful sense. It involves an actual reinterpretation of specific historical events, understanding them accurately for the first time, rather than through the distorted lens that defensiveness had previously applied. This reinterpretation tends to be considerably more uncomfortable than simple nostalgia, because it requires acknowledging that one's own perception throughout the relationship was genuinely unreliable, colouring even ordinary, reasonable interactions with a defensive framing that made a caring partner's behaviour seem burdensome or excessive when it wasn't. There's something worth naming about how this recognition process sometimes gets triggered by specific external prompts that have nothing directly to do with the avoidant's own reflection, encountering media that accurately describes patterns they recognize in themselves, a friend's offhand comment that lands with unexpected weight, therapy pursued for entirely unrelated reasons that happens to surface insight applicable to this specific relationship. These external prompts often accelerate a process that might otherwise unfold much more slowly through unprompted internal reflection alone, and understanding this can help explain why an avoidance recognition sometimes seems to arrive somewhat suddenly, connected to an identifiable external trigger, rather than developing purely through the gradual internal comparison process described earlier. It's worth exploring too how this recognition interacts with an avoidant's evolving understanding of their own attachment patterns more broadly, because genuine recognition of one specific relationship's value often coincides with, or directly prompts, a much larger reckoning with lifelong patterns extending well beyond this single relationship's specific history. An avoidant who finally recognizes what they lost in this particular relationship often begins simultaneously recognizing similar patterns across earlier relationships, friendships, even family dynamics, realizing that the specific failure to appreciate consistency and stability wasn't unique to this one situation, but represents a broader, more pervasive pattern shaping most of their significant relationships throughout life. This broader recognition, while considerably more difficult to fully process, often produces more durable and meaningful change than recognition limited to a single relationship alone, precisely because it addresses the underlying mechanism, rather than treating this one loss as an isolated, unfortunate incident. There's a particular consideration worth naming about how this recognition sometimes produces behavior that looks, from the outside, considerably different from what one might expect, based on genuine internal understanding. Some avoidants, having genuinely recognized their own patterns and the value they previously failed to appreciate, respond not by seeking reconciliation or communication, but by withdrawing even further from any relationship at all, at least temporarily, overwhelmed by the weight of what they've come to understand about their own contributing role in the loss. This withdrawal can look to anyone observing from a distance, like continued avoidance or lack of genuine reflection, when it may actually represent the opposite, a genuine reckoning so significant that it produces temporary paralysis rather than immediate visible action. It's worth exploring how this recognition connects to broader questions about grief and its typical, if often non-linear, progression, because much of what's being described throughout this exploration resembles a specific, delayed form of grieving that many avoidants experience only once sufficient distance and comparison have made the loss impossible to continue minimizing. This grief often follows a considerably different timeline than what the person originally left behind might experience, arriving later, developing more slowly, and frequently lacking the same immediate, socially recognized markers that typically accompany more conventional grief processes. Understanding this delayed timeline can help explain why an avoidant's genuine emotional processing of a relationship's loss sometimes seems to occur months or even years after the relationship's actual ending, long after most observers, including sometimes the avoidant themselves, would have assumed the processing had already fully concluded. There's something worth naming about how this entire dynamic shapes an avoidant's relationship to regret specifically, because regret, unlike simple sadness, carries a particular quality of self-implication that many avoidants find especially difficult to sit with for extended periods. Genuine regret about failing to recognize someone's value while it was available requires accepting a level of personal responsibility that conflicts directly with the self-protective narratives many avoidants have relied on throughout their lives to avoid feeling fundamentally at fault for relational difficulties. This means regret, once it genuinely develops, often gets managed through avoidance strategies, familiar from the avoidant's broader relational patterns, distraction, minimization, sometimes even a kind of productive busyness, specifically designed to prevent extended, uninterrupted time alone with uncomfortable, self-implicating thoughts. It's worth exploring, finally, what all of this means practically for anyone trying to determine whether pursuing any form of continued connection or eventual reconciliation with an avoidant partner who has demonstrated some signs of this recognition process represents a wise choice. The presence of genuine internal recognition, however real and significant, doesn't automatically translate into someone capable of sustaining a healthier relationship going forward, particularly if that recognition hasn't yet been paired with active, sustained work toward addressing the underlying patterns that originally produced the difficulty. Recognition represents necessary but insufficient evidence of genuine change, valuable as confirmation that someone's perception has become more accurate, but not yet sufficient proof that their actual behavioral capacity has meaningfully expanded alongside that improved perception. It's worth naming, too, a specific pattern regarding how mutual friends and family members sometimes become inadvertent witnesses to an avoidant's evolving recognition, even when the avoidant themselves never directly communicates it to the person it actually concerns. An avoidant processing this kind of delayed grief and recognition often needs somewhere to voice it, and mutual connections, friends who knew both people, family members who observed the relationship from some distance, frequently become the unintended recipients of comments and reflections the avoidant hasn't yet found the courage to communicate directly. This means information about an avoidant's private recognition sometimes reaches the original partner indirectly, through these secondhand channels, well before, if ever, it arrives through any direct communication. Understanding this possibility can help explain confusing situations where someone learns, through a mutual connection, that an avoidant ex-partner has expressed genuine regret or appreciation, information that arrives filtered through an intermediary, rather than delivered with the directness the listener might have preferred to receive it. There's something worth exploring about how this recognition process differs meaningfully depending on how the original relationship actually ended, because the specific circumstances of an ending shape both the timeline and the depth of whatever recognition eventually develops. A relationship that ended through the avoidant's own initiated withdrawal, a choice they made actively rather than one imposed upon them, often produces recognition that arrives more slowly and with more resistance, because acknowledging the value of what was lost requires confronting the fact that the loss was entirely self-inflicted, chosen rather than suffered. A relationship that ended through the other person's decision to leave, by contrast, sometimes produces faster, more immediate recognition, precisely because the avoidant didn't have the luxury of continuing to believe the relationship remained available to them on their own terms, forcing a confrontation with loss considerably sooner than a self-initiated ending typically requires. It's worth examining as well how this recognition process tends to interact with an avoidant's professional or creative life, an area that might seem entirely unconnected to romantic relationships, but that often reflects and processes similar underlying material in indirect ways. Some avoidants, unable or unwilling to directly communicate their recognition to the specific person it concerns, channel that processing into creative work, writing, art, or other forms of expression that allow the emotional content to surface without requiring the direct vulnerability of communicating it to its actual intended recipient. This displaced processing, while it may never reach the person who inspired it, still represents a genuine form of the same underlying recognition being described throughout this exploration, simply expressed through a channel that feels safer to the avoidant than direct communication would. There's a particular nuance worth naming about how age and life stage influence this entire recognition process, because avoidants at different points in their lives tend to experience and respond to this kind of delayed recognition quite differently. Younger avoidants, still early in their relational history, sometimes move through this recognition relatively quickly, absorbing it as one lesson among many still being learned through ongoing relational experience, applying whatever insight develops fairly directly to subsequent relationships without necessarily dwelling extensively on the specific relationship that first taught it. Older avoidants, particularly those confronting this recognition after a pattern has repeated across multiple significant relationships throughout their life, often experience it with considerably more weight and urgency, aware that time for correcting the underlying pattern feels more limited, which can either accelerate genuine, motivated change or, in some cases, produce a kind of resigned acceptance that meaningful change may no longer be realistically achievable at this stage of life. It's worth exploring, finally, how this entire dynamic connects to a broader question about what the listener actually needs from this understanding, independent of whatever the avoidant eventually does or doesn't do with their own private recognition. Many people seeking to understand whether an avoidant partner ever recognized their value are, at a deeper level, seeking validation that their own perception of the relationship's dynamics was accurate, that they weren't imagining or exaggerating the disconnect between what they were offering and what was being received in return. This validation, while understandably desired, doesn't actually require confirmation from the avoidant in order to be legitimate. The listener's own accurate perception throughout the relationship, their own consistent offering of genuine care, regardless of whether it was properly recognized in real time, stands as its own form of evidence, independent of whether the avoidant ever catches up to seeing it as clearly as the listener always did. There's something worth naming, too, about how this understanding should inform decisions about self-worth moving forward, particularly for anyone who has spent considerable time seeking external confirmation that their value was genuinely seen. Relying on an avoidant partner's eventual recognition, whether it ever arrives or not, as the primary source of validation for one's own worth places an enormous, ultimately unreliable burden on someone whose capacity for perception has already been demonstrated to be limited, at least during the period when that recognition actually mattered most. Building self-worth on a more stable foundation, one that doesn't depend on any specific person's eventual capacity to see clearly, tends to serve considerably better than waiting, sometimes indefinitely, for confirmation that may never arrive in any visible or satisfying form. The value itself was never contingent on being recognized in the first place. It existed fully and completely throughout the entire relationship, independent of whether the avoidant's own limited capacity for perception managed to register it accurately at the time. Understanding this distinction matters enormously for anyone whose sense of worth became entangled with whether a specific avoidant partner ever seemed to appreciate what they were offering. That worth was never actually determined by someone else's capacity to see it clearly. It simply was, and remains, real, regardless of how long it took, or whether it ever fully happened at all, for the avoidant to finally understand exactly what they had. There's a closing thought worth carrying forward from everything traced throughout this exploration, because it applies regardless of whether the specific avoidant in question ever reaches genuine recognition, and regardless of whether that recognition, if it develops, ever becomes visible in any form the listener can directly witness. The steady, patient care that was once offered didn't require an audience in order to have been genuine. It didn't require correct perception from its intended recipient in order to have mattered. It existed as its own complete act, valuable on its own terms, offered by someone capable of exactly the kind of consistency and depth that so many relationships, avoidant or otherwise, ultimately struggle to sustain. Whatever an avoidant partner eventually comes to understand about what they lost, whether that understanding remains permanently private or someday finds its way into direct acknowledgement, changes nothing about what was actually true the entire time. The value was real, it was offered freely, and it deserves to be remembered as exactly that, regardless of how long recognition takes to arrive, or whether it ever fully arrives at all. That remembering belongs entirely to the listener now, independent of anyone else's timeline whatsoever, independent of anyone else's capacity for insight, and independent of whether the specific avoidant who once failed to see it clearly ever manages to catch up to a truth that was, in the end, never really theirs to confirm or deny in the first place. What was genuinely real remains fully and completely real, held quietly and completely by the person who actually lived it, regardless of who else eventually, someday, comes around to genuinely understanding it, or how long that particular understanding ultimately, eventually takes to finally genuinely arrive at all.